I'm just gonna start by like broadly explaining my project, my PhD project, and then I will share some slides that will kind of talk more systematically about a chapter from my thesis. So my broader thesis looks at Chinese digital investments in the Middle East and North Africa. I mainly focus, as Pascal said, on Algeria and Egypt. And I've been trying to understand mainly to what extent does the influx of Chinese digital capital into the region helps with processes of technological upgrading. So I'm based in like the International Development Department at the LSE, and I've been trying to look at the question from like a development perspective, and also obviously looking at the political implications of increased China's increased digital presence in the region. So I'm just going to share some slides. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yeah, amazing. So the title of the chapter I'm presenting today is called Reproducing Beijing's Data Governance Regime, Data Localization and Infrastructural Control in North Africa. And as I said, this is like one of the chapters of my broader PhD. So initially, I was very much interested in the question of technology transfer, like kind of like traditional development economists who are like, very much interested in this sphere. So I always wondered, whether kind of South-South collaboration and more Chinese investments in the digital sector in the region was maybe contributing to more technology transfer. So one of my chapter looks at this question of technology transfer with this model. So this is for me, I was imagining like the digital multinational corporation in the middle, and then like all the different linkages and like the vertical spillovers and the horizontal spillovers as theorized by Albert Hirschman, among others, right? So it's like looking at student trainings, also with universities and labor movement between corporations and so on. And then I realized that that this model could very much be applied to any other model, right? So like these spillovers and linkages could be applied to the pharmaceutical sector, to car manufacturing, to textile manufacturing, and so on. And I tried to like, theoretically move towards kind of like the infrastructural lens that is becoming increasingly popular now in like the study of like digital infrastructure in general, and try to look at the characteristics of the digital sector in particular. And this brought me to the question of data, right? And instead of looking at technology transfer as something that happens from the multinational, let's say Huawei in this case, to local economies, look at the other way and like the other direction, I guess, of knowledge transfer. And this would be obviously through the transfer of digital data. And so, as you all know, data has economic value. Some have called it the new oil or the oil of the 21st century. This graph shows the like economic value, like the value chain of data. So data is initially collected, stored, it's analyzed, and then data is monetized, often by big corporations, as Sarah was explaining. So it could be through the sell of targeted ads online. It's what Google and now Meta does, operating e-commerce platforms like Amazon, Alibaba, and some other big actors, transforming traditional goods into rentable services, and finally providing cloud services. And there's some big actors out there. Sarah was just speaking about that. It is actually like a great intro, like you're saving me a lot of time of things like I won't have to say, but we know that like our Amazon Web Service is a major actor, such as like, and also Microsoft Azure, Alibaba Cloud, and increasingly Huawei Cloud. And here I'm going to focus on this, on Huawei and like Huawei's provision of cloud services. The interesting thing here, as we just saw with the previous presentation, Huawei is actually not a major actor in cloud provision, but it is becoming an increasingly important actor in cloud provision with sovereigns. So with governments, mainly governments across Africa and the Middle East, and also public-owned and state-owned enterprises. And that's like the interesting characteristics of Huawei. It's not very competitive when it comes to like business and like private corporations deciding to store their data and rent out one of these services. Like Amazon Web Services would definitely be more popular. But when it comes to sovereigns, Huawei is emerging as a major actor. So one of the key research questions I'm asking in this chapter is, are Chinese-built data centers in host middle-income countries contributing to narrowing global asymmetries in data control? And are these infrastructural projects diffusing data governance regimes or like Chinese technopolitical regimes in data control? So it's like the whole idea that, infrastructure holds power and there is power embedded in these technologies, and asking whether like this influx of Chinese built data centers are contributing to shaping different data governance regimes. So broadly speaking, there are like three major data governance frameworks that have been competing. The first one has been established by the US as like kind of the country that very much created and shaped the internet. So it was very much about the free flow of data. It's a market-centered model, and it has usually a narrow set of obligations. It's the idea that like, data should be this free commodity that flows, and that countries should not apply strict or rigid regulations in trying to control data. There's the EU model, well captured by the GDPR, which is becoming like the gold standard in terms of like data privacy and like data control. So here data flow is more restricted. It's an individual-centered model and privacy is paramount. And then there is the Chinese model, where data localization in strategic sectors is key. Very important. Data is very much seen as like a valuable resource and a strategic one that needs to be controlled by the state. It's a state-centered model, and here national security is paramount. So this model, like the Chinese model, has been very attractive across the global South, because it's a model that has succeeded in securing quite spectacular development, like digital development. China is today one of the only countries that can really compete with US tech giants. And at the same time, it allowed like the bolstering and the strengthening of national sovereignty. So a lot of governments across the global South and across the Middle East are very attracted to this model and have tried to reproduce it. This is a picture from the Senegalese government back in 2021, when they decided to localize data domestically through the help of Huawei. So initially, data of most government agencies in Senegal was stored abroad, and there was a decision to localize this data with the help of Huawei. So we're seeing a drive in many countries across the global South to localize an increasing share of their data domestically, right? So as Sarah was showing in the image, like the African continent is actually is the continent that has the least number of data centers, of co-location data centers, and the Middle East has a very small number, especially if we exclude high-income Gulf states. And so there is a drive increasingly to build more of this type of infrastructure. So in Algeria, what you can see on like the screen capture on the left is that Tebboune, the current president, is insisting for the attribution of projects to Huawei to build data centers in the country. That's like very recent. It's like the 19th of February this year. He made a statement saying that Algeria, for strategic reasons and for achieving more data sovereignty, had to localize an increasing share of its data with Huawei. And what you see on the right is a picture of the Algerian customs that had signed back in 2018 an agreement with Huawei to build like local data centers and to kind of store their data domestically. So there is this idea that, in a way, partnering with Huawei would help countries reproduce China's model, which was successful in both, as I said, guaranteeing digital sovereignty, but also achieving spectacular rates of digital development. So in this chapter, I have two main case studies of so a corporation, a state-owned one, and a research center in the region that have decided to localize an increasing share of their data by partnering with Huawei. So in Algeria, I look at the case of Sonatrach, which is the state-owned oil company, by far the most important enterprise in the country. And in Egypt, I look at the National Research Center, المركز القومي للبحوث, and both these this institution and this firm have partnered with Huawei for their data localization. So my methodology, I did a bit of field work. So in Egypt and Algeria, actually in Egypt, I was a visiting researcher at CEDEJ. So I'm happy to be speaking here today. So I did semi-structured interviews. I've analyzed laws regulating data flows, cybersecurity, and privacy. And I have also used secondary data from like media coverage and like also statements from the corporations and agencies I'm studying here. So let's start with Sonatrach. As you can see, so like if you go on Huawei's website, there is like this image of like Sonatrach transforms its oil fields in Algeria. So before 2020, Sonatrach had most of its data stored abroad in like servers that were scattered across Europe and like North America mainly. And however, like through time, during the mid 2010s, there was a realization that this data was highly strategic, especially considering the importance of energy in Algeria's economy. And there was a decision to localize an increasing share of this data. So the project started like in quite an ambitious way in terms of like digital transformation and like development of the local digital industry, because Sonatrach started by developing its own in-house data center. And it had a storing facility that was quite significant. Like it was 5 data centers that were accessible to the different branches and subsidiaries of Sonatrach. However, in 2019, the firm decided to abandon this plan to mainly have its own in-house data infrastructure and decided to sublease the governance of its data to Huawei. And there was this high-level partnership signed with the idea to increase efficiency. So it's something that we can read on the statement that Huawei released after the deal was signed. It said that Sonatrach's infrastructure was initially riddled with inefficiencies and it had interoperability issues as its hardware had been supplied by various technology vendors. Huawei seeks to tackle these inefficiencies of Sonatrach's data infrastructure by providing its own cloud service, right? Sorry, here there's a sentence missing. So we see that initially there was efforts to localize data by building indigenous kind of like and local data infrastructure, mobilizing a lot of local engineers and using kind of like Algeria's local IT infrastructure to localize this data. But there was a shift quite quickly within a few years to just rent out and lease data storage, but also data processing to Huawei. And this obviously comes with a set of political and economic implications. The case of Egypt's National Research Center is quite similar. So initially you had the NRC had most of its data stored abroad, but in 2016, against the backdrop of this global wave for data localization, the NRC engaged in data localization. However, the running costs were high, and this comes actually from an interview I did in Cairo with one of the managers of the cloud service. He said that there was a struggle to keep top-notch engineers. It was very costly for us to maintain talent, even with salaries higher than the average for a public research organization. So qualified engineers were quickly poached by the large tech multinationals present in the country. And many also left Egypt to join big tech firms across the world. So it was very hard for the NRC to run its own in-house data centers. And that was, like for the Sonatrach case, a decision to lease the management of its data and data infrastructure to Huawei. So Huawei, same thing, there's this like emphasis in kind of trying to justify this by like emphasizing the idea that it would be more efficient to work with Huawei. And we can see on its release that like operation and management was going to be simpler by using Huawei, and it was going to lower the skill requirements and helping to ensure stable services. So interviews, however, in both countries revealed that Huawei continued having access to this data, and like the capacity to process the data was still very much between the hands of Huawei. So, there was this effort to localize data geographically. It's true that now for both the NRC and Huawei and Sonatrach, the data is localized within national territory. However, when it comes to like processing capacity and the capacity to extract value and knowledge from this data, this very much remains between the hand of Chinese actors and Huawei in this case. So data localization without infrastructural control is very much like what my fieldwork revealed as, what's happening now in many organizations and firms, public firms mainly, collaborating with Huawei in this sphere. So the two case studies reveal that the initial ambition to localize data through on-premises services was dropped by both Sonatrach and the NRC in favor of Huawei cloud services for data storage and processing. Ongoing data localization efforts are only superficially enabling the domestic storing of data, while the processing, as I just said, is still controlled by foreign firms. And this form of data localization is depriving domestic cloud actors of significant learning and upgrading opportunities. So obviously this has significant implications economically. So if we consider that oil and that data is the new oil, and that whoever gets to process it and extract insights from it is put at a more advantageous position in like the global digital economy, then the question of who gets to process this data is obviously central. And so leveraging the full developmental power of data requires not only like the territorial localization of data as we're seeing now, but also effective control over the corporations that build, operate, and maintain the underpinning infrastructure, regardless of the corporation's country of origin. So obviously here I'm talking about Huawei in particular, as I mentioned, and what Sarah said earlier, it's still like a marginal actor within like the broader cloud industry, but an increasingly significant one with like governments and state-owned corporations. Just to conclude, Chinese firms, like their US competitors, are maybe becoming new custodians of locally generated data, with significant implication for the future of African knowledge economies. Reclaiming infrastructural control might be necessary to avoid the reproduction and entrenchment of data inequality. And industrial policy can potentially support the construction, maintenance, and growth of domestic data infrastructure and capabilities. And having spoken during my fieldwork to policymakers in both Egypt and Algeria, it seems that there is awareness about this, but often there is just this choice, as like the two case studies I just discussed, there's just this preference for often easier options that allow big corporations to just come and run the data instead of maybe investing more resources and efforts in trying to have a domestic data infrastructure and building more capabilities. Great, I'm gonna stop here, but thank you for listening.